Good evening and thanks for joining us. As the president's European trip comes to a close, his final day abroad included a stop in Turkey, his first trip as president to a majority Muslim nation. Although the White House says this was not the major address in a Muslim capital within the first 100 days that Obama had promised, that is still to come apparently. The president did give a speech in Turkey on the floor of the Turkish parliament, and he scheduled a trip to Istanbul's famous Blue Mosque before Air Force One starts the long trip home. There has been a lot of symbolic importance in this trip. The new president's first trip abroad, the scrambling of other world leaders to associate themselves with him. I'm talking to you, Nicola. The massive protests in multiple venues that weren't mostly against the American president for once. A lot of symbol and style to reflect on in this trip. But in terms of substance, the big substantial policy news from this trip abroad was made in Prague before an open-air crowd of 20,000 people, where the president, as promised, laid out his goal of a world with zero nuclear weapons. Because it was a real policy speech, the crowd in Prague stood politely through a lot of really detailed talk about treaties and START and SORT and proliferation security and international fuel banks before they got to the "I'll tell my kids about this, man can this guy give a speech" part.
We know the path when we choose fear over hope. To denounce or shrug off a call for cooperation is an easy but also a cowardly thing to do. That's how wars begin. That's where human progress ends. There is violence and injustice in our world that must be confronted. We must confront it not by splitting apart, but by standing together as free nations, as free people. I know that a call to arms can stir the souls of men and women more than a call to lay them down. But that is why the voices for peace and progress must be raised together. Those are the voices that still echo through the streets of Prague. Those are the ghosts of 1968. Those were the joyful sounds of the Velvet Revolution. Those were the Czechs who helped bring down a nuclear-armed empire without firing a shot. Human destiny will be what we make of it. And here in Prague, let us honor our past by reaching for a better future. Let us bridge our divisions, build upon our hopes, accept our responsibility to leave this world more prosperous and more peaceful than we found it. Together, we can do it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prague.
Prague goes wild! Prague goes wild! All right, back at home, here was the reaction from the right.
I just think that it's very dangerous to have a fantasy foreign policy, and it can get you in enormous trouble.
Former Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, given the honor of responding to President Obama on Fox News. This is a fantasy. He's living in a dream world. What a naive and wild and irresponsible liberal you'd have to be to advocate a world without nuclear weapons. Who would ever say something so crazy?
We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
Ronald Reagan, noted naive leftist fantasizer. For understanding the state of the Republican Party today and the conservative movement today, for understanding the state of the domestic opposition to Barack Obama's foreign policy and his counterterrorism agenda, it is perhaps impossible to overstate the irony that the argument that Obama is indulging in foreign policy fantasy is being advanced by Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, the man who just last week proposed that he would prevent the North Koreans from launching a missile by using a laser or some other device.
If I can't find a way to bribe somebody to blow it up, I'd find a way to have either a small team go in or a way to deliver either a laser or another kind of device.
A laser. So the guy who says working toward a world without nuclear weapons is fantasy, his not fantasy is to destroy North Korea's missiles with speckled laser beams. And if that doesn't work out, there's always plan B.
You know, I have one simple request. and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
The real silver lining here, other than the fact that Newt Gingrich is not president, is that the North Koreans, honestly, are sort of really awful at launching missiles. This is their third attempt since 1998 and their third failure. Or, as armscontrolwonk.com today put it, quote, 0 for 3. These guys really suck. The rocket the North Koreans launched yesterday was a 3-stage missile. The missile's first stage dropped into the Sea of Japan. The second stage dropped into the Pacific Ocean, as did the third stage, which of course included the satellite they were trying to launch into orbit. Before the launch, North Korea announced certain safety zones where they expected those first 2 stages to land. According to Japan's Yomiuri newspaper, the first stage did splash down roughly where it was expected to. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner of that graphic there. Stage 2, not so much. The little parallelogram looking box on the right, that's where stage 2 was supposed to land. That little dot way up to the left of it, that's where stage 2 actually came down. The failure of the launch has not stopped North Korea from bragging on it anyway. The official state media said not only that the satellite was accurately launched, they also said, quote, the satellite is sending to the Earth the melodies of the immortal revolutionary paeans, Song of General Kim Il-sung and Song of General Kim Jong-il. So the North Korean satellite is up there in orbit right now, converting us all to Maoism through song. Also, Newt Gingrich is president. Joining us now is Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. He's the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. Joe joins us tonight from Denver, where he's attending my beloved conference on world affairs at Boulder. Joe, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Rachel.
Technologically, is North Korea just sort of bad at launching missiles?
This was a major embarrassment for them. Not only did it demonstrate the limits of their Scud-based technology, but it certainly undercut any efforts they might have had or imagined of selling this technology to other countries. Even if this rocket had succeeded, if it had been a successful satellite launch, it is still woefully short of any major threat to the United States. For example, the payload of this rocket was estimated to be a satellite weighing about 300 pounds. It was supposed to go into low Earth orbit. To deliver a nuclear warhead, you have to have a payload capacity of a ton. 2,000 pounds at a minimum. You also have to have a warhead small enough to fit. They don't have that. You also have to have a re-entry vehicle that can survive the stresses and strains of coming back into the Earth's atmosphere. They don't have that. For them to have a real nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile capability will require years of effort, years of highly observable tests. They're nowhere near that.
So, Joe, we do know that North Korea has caused some sort of nuclear explosion. In the fall of 2006, they blew something up. We know that they are starving their people in favor of feeding their own appetite for weaponry, and that the whole ideology of the regime there hinges on the idea of a militarized nation facing all enemies, most specifically South Korea and the United States. North Korea seems like an awful place, but how dangerous is it to the United States? Is the danger to us hinging totally on what you describe as a sort of improbable threat from ICBMs?
They do represent a threat, and they do have a nuclear weapons capability. They are an exporter of missile technology, and you don't want to see any of that happening. The major threat is not that if they get a nuclear weapon, they would use it against us. For them, this is a defensive measure. They may be a bully, but they're a very insecure bully. They think of themselves as surrounded and besieged. They need a weapon to give them that kind of security. The major danger from North Korea is actually what would happen in the neighborhood if they should consolidate as a nuclear weapon state. What would South Korea do? What would Japan do? You can imagine a ripple effect going through the neighborhood. I believe that we are going to see in the next few weeks the same pattern we've seen in previous tests. After they blow something up, succeed or fail, they can be brought back to the negotiating table. It happened in 1996 after the first missile failure. It happened 3 weeks after 2006, after that missile failure, when the Bush administration finally started negotiating with them. them. I think this whole thing is basically about them increasing their negotiating value, putting bigger chips on the table.
And of course, we had them launching this missile, however incompetently, within a day of President Obama giving his big and much anticipated speech on proliferation and nuclear weapons and his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And President Obama said in that speech, I'm not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. Of course, the right-wing attack on him is that this is not only naive, that it's fantasy and it's a bad idea to even work toward it. Joe, you've been in this field your whole adult life. Do you feel like what he's outlining here is an achievable goal, and what he's proposing to do to achieve it is the kind of thing that might work?
It is absolutely achievable, and in fact, I believe it is the only security course a nation such as the United States can responsibly take. I am flabbergasted at the one that people still listen to Newt Gingrich or John Bolton or people of that ilk, and the